On April 4, 1975, a United States Air Force C-5A Galaxy, the largest cargo aircraft in the American military inventory, lifted off from Tan Son Nha Hoot Air Base outside Saigon carrying 328 people. Most of them were children. Some were infants strapped into cardboard boxes because there were not enough seats. The plane reached an altitude of 23,000 feet. Then a cargo door in the rear of the aircraft blew off. The explosive decompression tore through the rear compartment. The hydraulic systems that controlled the tail failed completely. The pilots had no rudder, no elevator control, and no way to turn the airplane. They had approximately 8 minutes to put it on the ground before it became uncontrollable. They almost made it. The crash of that C-5A killed 138 people, including 78 children. It happened on the first official flight of Operation Babylift, a program President Gerald Ford had announced just 2 days earlier with a speech designed to move Americans to action. The cameras were rolling. The compassion was real. The chaos behind the scenes was something else entirely. To understand Operation Babylift, you have to understand what Saigon looked like in April 1975. The North Vietnamese army had been advancing steadily since January. Province after province had fallen. The speed of the collapse had shocked even the most pessimistic analysts at the CIA. By late March, it was no longer a question of whether Saigon would fall, but when. American embassy personnel were beginning quiet preparations for evacuation. The South Vietnamese government was publicly insisting the city would hold. Almost no one believed them. Inside this collapsing city were thousands of children in orphanages. Some were the children of Vietnamese parents who had placed them in care during the war, intending to reclaim them when circumstances improved. Some were American children, the sons and daughters of American servicemen and Vietnamese women who faced an especially precarious future under a communist government that viewed them as living symbols of American imperialism. Some were genuine orphans, children whose parents had been killed by years of war. The distinctions mattered enormously for what came next, though in the chaos of April 1975, no one had time to sort them out carefully. The adoption pipeline between Vietnam and the United States had been operating for years. American families had been adopting Vietnamese children since the early 1960s, and by 1975 there were thousands of pending adoption cases in various stages of processing. When it became clear that Saigon was going to fall, adoption agencies, American officials, and humanitarian organizations began pushing to accelerate those cases, to get the children out before the new government could freeze the process. The pressure was enormous. The paperwork was incomplete. The legal frameworks were ambiguous. And the clock was running. President Ford's announcement of Operation Babylift on April 3rd was partly a humanitarian response and partly a political calculation. The images of Vietnamese children being airlifted to safety played well in a country exhausted by the war and looking for something to feel good about. USAID Administrator Daniel Parker was dispatched to Saigon to oversee the operation. The military was tasked with providing aircraft. The first flight was assigned to a C-5A Galaxy from the 60th Military Airlift Wing, call sign Reach 385. It was loaded with children, adult escorts, and aid workers, and it took off at 4:08 p.m. on April 4th. The C-5A Galaxy was not designed to carry passengers. It was a military cargo aircraft, enormous and powerful, built to haul tanks and artillery pieces. The passenger accommodations for Operation Babylift were improvised. Children were placed on the upper deck in seats and on the floor. Infants were secured in cardboard boxes lined with blankets. Some babies were simply held by adult escorts who sat on the floor of the cargo bay. The preparations had been rushed. The manifest was incomplete. No one knew exactly how many people were on the airplane. Captain Dennis Traynor was the aircraft commander. He had 25 years of military aviation experience. His crew was competent and professional. None of that would matter for what happened at 23,000 feet when the rear cargo door locking mechanism failed. The C-5A's aft cargo door blew outward into the slipstream. The explosive decompression killed or incapacitated everyone in the unpressurized rear compartment instantly. The hydraulic lines running through the tail section were severed. Traynor and his co-pilot found themselves flying the largest aircraft in the American military inventory with no tail controls, using only differential engine thrust to maintain some semblance of directional control. Trainer turned the aircraft back toward Tan Son Nhut using throttle inputs alone. He declared an emergency. He began a controlled descent that was barely controlled at all. The aircraft was oscillating, difficult to hold level, responding sluggishly to every input. He aimed for the runway. He came in too fast and too steep. The C-5A touched down in a rice paddy approximately 2 miles short of the runway threshold, bounced back into the air, crossed a dike, came down again, shed its wings and landing gear, and skidded to a stop in pieces across the flat ground south of the base perimeter. The survivors were in the upper deck. The children who had been in the lower cargo compartment and those who had been in the rear of the aircraft were gone. Of the 328 people aboard, 138 died. 78 of them were children. 52 were American adults, including aid workers and military escorts. 8 were South Vietnamese adults. The survivors, many of them badly injured, were pulled from the wreckage by rescue workers who arrived within minutes. The rescue operation was chaotic in ways that compounded the original chaos. The surviving children were transported to hospitals across the Saigon area and then airlifted to the United States in subsequent flights. The records that did exist were incomplete, inaccurate, or destroyed in the crash. Children were matched with families based on whatever paperwork could be assembled, and in some cases the matches were wrong. Children who had been placed in Vietnamese orphanages by living parents, not orphaned at all in the legal sense, were flown to the United States and placed with American adoptive families before their biological parents could be located. The parents in the collapsing country had no way to find them. Operation Babylift continued after the crash. Over the following weeks, before Saigon fell on April 30th, approximately 3,300 children were evacuated from South Vietnam to the United States and other countries. The operation generated enormous public enthusiasm in America. Families lined up at airports to receive children. Volunteers worked around the clock to process the arrivals. Photographs of American families holding Vietnamese babies circulated across the country and were received as images of compassion and hope in the middle of a catastrophe. Behind those photographs were complications that would take decades to fully surface. The question of who these children actually were, whether they had truly been orphaned, whether their biological families had consented to adoption or had simply been unable to stop it in the chaos of the collapse, would haunt the operation for years. A class action lawsuit filed in 1975 by the Center for Constitutional Rights alleged that many of the children evacuated under Operation Babylift had not been legally available for adoption, that some had living parents in Vietnam who had placed them in orphanages temporarily and fully intended to reclaim them. The lawsuit resulted in a settlement that created a process for Vietnamese parents to seek the return of their children. Fewer than 20 families ever successfully reunited through that process. Some of the children themselves, grown now into adults in their 40s and 50s, have spent portions of their lives trying to answer a simple question: who am I? The documentation that would have answered that question was either lost in the crash, destroyed in the fall of Saigon, or never existed in the first place. DNA testing has helped some. Organizations dedicated to connecting Operation Babylift survivors with their biological families have had partial success. The reunions, when they happen, are complicated, emotional, and incomplete. A person in their late 40s meeting biological siblings in Vietnam who grew up under communism while they grew up in Ohio does not have an easy reunion. They share genetics and almost nothing else. Captain Dennis Trainer was awarded the Mackay Trophy for the most meritorious flight of 1975 by the Air Force Association, recognizing his skill in bringing the stricken aircraft down in a way that saved any lives at all. The citation noted that his airmanship under impossible conditions was the reason approximately 175 people survived a crash that should have killed everyone aboard. Trainer accepted the award quietly. He spoke rarely about the flight in subsequent years. The 78 children who died were not named in the award citation. The Air Force investigation into the crash determined that the aft cargo door latch mechanism had failed due to a design defect that had been identified in a previous incident in 1974. A safety recommendation had been issued. The modification had not been completed on all aircraft in the fleet. The C-5A that took off from Tan Son Nhut on April 4, 1975, had not received the modification, a known defect, a pending fix, a deadline that ran out before the airplane did. 38 children who survived the crash were adopted by families in the United States. Some grew up knowing the full story of how they arrived. Some did not learn about the crash until they were adults. One survivor, a woman named Birgit Fischer who was adopted by a family in Germany, spent years researching the flight before writing about her experience. She described the strange weight of being a survivor of something you cannot remember, of carrying a history inside you that preceded your own conscious life. The Vietnamese children who came to the United States through Operation Babylift are in their 50s now. They are accountants and teachers and doctors and parents. They live in Ohio and California and Minnesota and Texas. Some have returned to Vietnam, some have not. Some have found their biological families, some never will. The war ended for America on April 30th, 1975. For the children of Operation Babylift, certain questions have never ended at all. There is a video on screen right now that goes deeper into the final days of the Vietnam War and what the collapse of Saigon cost the people who were left behind. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. These are the ones that deserve to be remembered.